There we go. Oh, how's everyone doing? Yeah. Oh, that was positive. Hi, I'm Mark. I'm apparently the one who has all final say about all things Bouncy Castle, which I never knew. They didn't teach you that in church planting school, that all Bouncy Castle decisions will be blamed on you. We have been in Jonah for the last 2 weeks. This is our third. It's a 3-week series. This is the last one. We've had loads of fun, or at least I've had loads of fun, mainly because it means I get to buy some inflatables, which I love. I'm a big inflatable addict. We're doing Jonah because Jesus told us to. When a load of religious sort of teachers asked him to sort of test him, do a sign for us, he said, actually, the only sign you're going to get is Jonah, this story from the Old Testament, which they knew. And then he referenced his death and the bit in the middle, and then his resurrection. And he said that, he basically used the story of Jonah as an analogy for what was going to come with him. And so looking ahead to Easter, we just think it would just be really great to dig into this story and find out what we can learn about ourselves, about our call to this city, about everything that God has done at the cross, Easter Saturday, and the resurrection. And so week 1, we talked about the boat. We talked about just as Jonah went away on a boat in the opposite direction to the call that God gave him. And there's a line in there that he went away from the presence of God, which was a lie. He didn't actually go from the presence of God because God is everywhere. But he thought that he was going from the presence of God. And so we talked about what are our boats? What are the things that we do that we think take us away from the presence of God? The things we do intentionally or the things we do unintentionally that remove us from God. And actually that's a lie. God is everywhere. And so we sort of reflected together. And actually God is in everything. And God wants to meet us in our mess, which is the absolute epicenter of the point of Good Friday. That moment of the cross where God says through Jesus, I love you and I am in with you in the mess, in whatever you've done. So we talked about the boat, which is like Good Friday. Then we talked about the whale. And the whale is this deepest, darkest pit that we can go into, the moments of despair, the longings that we've longed for that God doesn't seem to want to do anything about, or sometimes, if we're honest, doesn't even feel like he cares. We had this beautiful moment at the end last week where everyone came and they put post-it notes saying, what their whale is, what their dark thing is, what the thing that they really struggle to believe that there's hope in. And we talked about this reality that there's hope in the middle of the darkness. And we learned from Jonah's example of being in the whale and praying these prayers of hope and how to do that. So it's like Easter Saturday. It's like this transition point between the death of Jesus and the resurrection. There's this thing where there's this tangible hope in the air, but there's also this complete disorientating, uncertain messiness. And then today we're going to talk about a plant. So we've got the worst inflatable of the 3. Doesn't even stand upright. If you're ever going to buy an inflatable plant, let me know. I'll send you the Amazon link so you don't buy this one. I've had to sellotape it up to a microphone stand. We're going to talk about the plant. And actually, I was going to talk about something completely different or fairly different. And it's landed slightly differently. Almost in the last 24 hours. So some of this is a bit rough and ready, and I apologize. But I think God's got a word for us in this morning. In the plant, we're going to read this passage together, and we're just going to sort of wrestle. It's a bit messy and it's a bit complicated, and I don't really understand it, which is what all sermons should start with. But I would love us just to go with it, because I think there's something really here that God might have for us as we look towards this sort of final piece in this picture of sort of reflecting around the Easter story of what does resurrection look like. What does it look like for us not just to be resuscitated, not just to made a little bit different or made back to as good as we were before, but to be completely different? To be what does it look like for us to be full of that power? We were talking about the resurrection at Pub Theology on Wednesday, shameless plug, and someone who's actually here in the room, just as we were sort of wrestling and chatting, he said, isn't it incredible that like David and Solomon and Moses and all these guys had less of God's power in them in a tangible way that they would have felt all of the time than we do now because of what Jesus did at the resurrection? Which just blew my mind. It's been on my head all week. So this is the longest introduction ever. So if you would like a Bible, I would love you to take one. If you don't have a paper Bible, it's our gift to you. They're on the room dividers. Come and grab one. We are in Jonah. Chapter 3 and chapter 4, they're really short chapters, so don't worry. It will come up on the screen as well. And it all gets a bit weird. So Jonah, been told to go somewhere, has said no, gone away, God's found him. He's ended up in a whale. The whale has now vomited him back up. And in his post-vomit reality, we're here in Jonah chapter 3. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you, exactly the same as chapter 1. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord, different to chapter 1, and went to Nineveh. Now Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming 40 more days, and Nineveh will be overthrown. The Ninevites believed God. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. When Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. This is the proclamation he issued in Nineveh. By the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks, taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink, but let people and animals be covered in sackcloth. I just had this picture of someone putting sackcloth on their pet hamster or something. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows? God may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. When God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. And chapter 4. But to Jonah this seemed very wrong. And he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is why I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live." But the Lord replied, "Is it right for you to be angry?" Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. Then the Lord God provided a leafy plant and made it grow over Jonah to give him shade for his head to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. This just gets so weird, doesn't it? But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm which chewed the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head. It's all very head-centric, isn't it? Perhaps he was bald. So that he grew faint. He wanted to die and said, "It would be better for me to die than to live." But God said to Jonah, "Is it right for you to be angry about the plant?" "It is," he said. "And I'm so angry that I wish I was dead." But the Lord said, "You have been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. And should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals?" Because every book should finish with the phrase, "and also many animals." So we've got this crazy story where Jonah goes and does what he's been told to do. He has immediate and profound impact, despite what anyone in that moment would have thought was going to happen. And he's angry at this, and then we find out some of the reason why he didn't want to go in the first place, because he was worried that exactly what has happened would happen. So he goes and builds himself a little hut in the desert on a hill. So east of Nineveh would be mountains. So he went up and out so he could see what God was going to do. And then God provides a plant. Jonah loves the plant, sits under the plant. His, I'm assuming, bald head is protected from the scorching sun by the plant. He's delighted with this. The plant then disappears. He's even more angry than he was before, and also many animals. It's just a really bizarre story. And so we can sort of work out that there's this like object lesson that Jonah is getting from God around the whole point of the plant is for him to understand that, you know, he cares this much about this silly little plant that he's not tended to and that he's not grown, he has no responsibility for. And yet, how much more could God love this place full of humans? But actually, I think there's something so much deeper than this if we just dig into some of the narrative, if we dig into some of the stuff that's going on. I think actually what Jonah has gone to do is he's been told by God explicitly there's a city that he wants to impact. There's a city who he wants him to engage with. And he's heard this clearly now twice. And he's been shown what is going to happen if he doesn't do it, so now he's doing it. So he's been told, like we have as a church, that there's a city that needs God. that needs the presence of God. And instead of doing it properly, he goes and sort of hides, but intentionally, it says in the passage, watches. He wants to see what's going to happen. So he's been told to go and be an influence, but actually he just sits and watches from on high to see what God is going to do. And I think there are three things in this passage that keep Jonah in that place of watching. And actually, I found this the hardest to write because I think there are three things that I find really hard. I find really hard when it comes to me, following God's call to do what I believe I've been, called to do. But just I know for me personally, this stuff's really real and really live. So I think there are three attitudes that we discover through this passage that Jonah has that keep him in that place of distance and watching instead of getting involved with what God is doing. So we're going to go through all three. And because I'm a simple person, they all begin with C. So the first attitude is condemnation. The first attitude is condemnation. I wonder if you would say that you have any enemies. There's this context of frenemies where you can have friends that are actually your enemies, which I've never really sort of worked out for myself, but apparently it's a thing that people have. I wonder if there are people who you just really struggle to be around. We have an awfully large football game going on in Manchester today. And I would imagine that the 70, 80% of the non-travelling fans probably would describe some degree of antipathy towards the 20% of people who are travelling from a different city to shout loudly for their club. I'm an absolute sports addict. I will watch anything, but normally I get quite animated, particularly if I've got a vested interest in the team that I'm supporting, towards the official referee, umpire, whatever it's called, in a moment of an incorrect decision. There were multiple of those against France yesterday, and I feel it's my duty to inform said black and white striped person that they're wrong. And we'll do it quite ardently. And it seems that without really realizing it, I probably in my actions, communicate that I'm not the biggest fan of some of the other people in the world. And that is just the biggest understatement or comparison of how Jonah would have felt. Like, these guys were the worst. They were the absolute, evilest people that potentially ever existed. If we dig into some of the stuff that was going on, we're kind of very quickly on Jonah's side. It's quite easy to look at it and be like, Jonah, why can't you be a bit happier that all these guys are coming to God? So Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were known to be the most savage thing ever. And what they would do is they would do empire in a way that they would go and take land, and they would take towns, and they would take countries, and they would take people, and then they would debilitate the stuff that was a bit further away so that they couldn't regain strength and rise up again. So there's numerous stuff in the ancient literature about what they did. A few examples. They went to great efforts in a couple of places to plow salt into all of the fields around so they could never grow anything again, to actually become a sort of sustainable, booming economy. They once diverted an entire river, as in just dug, like you do on the beach, but instead with a big river, to go through an entire city, to just completely destroy it and wipe it out from the face of the earth. They used to, they would cut off one arm and one leg of everybody so that they couldn't form an army again, or, rise up and strike back. For the Jew, the most brutal thing, and there's some debate on this amongst scholars, but one train of thought of the origin of the Samaritan people was that the Assyrians knew, when the Jews were in captivity, they knew that the thing that they held on most tightly to was their sort of cultural, racial identity. They knew the thing that would make them feel the most dominated would be to force them to intermarry with people who weren't Jews. And that's what they did. So Assyrians and Jews intermarried, had children, and they're the Samaritans. They're this people who we find out in the New Testament, the Jewish people hate. Because it represents that not being able to be in control. And so this is the context that God is asking Jonah to go. These people who he just detests. He just cannot stand. He wouldn't want to go anywhere near them. In fact, he'd fear for his life going anywhere near them. But even if he survived, he would never want them to encounter any of the goodness of the God who he believed in. And yet he goes, and again, it looks like he's doing what he's been told. But there's a strong argument to say he's not really doing it very well. So it says, Nineveh, verse 3 and 4, Nineveh takes 3 days to walk across, and it says he only took a day. So he literally does a bit, and then it's just like, I'm done. I've done a bit. I've done a third. That's enough for me. And then even his proclamation, 40 more days and Nineveh will be destroyed, is not the most bulky, well thought out, expansive sort of chat that a prophet has ever done. It's almost certainly short and trite and just, he's not really making an effort. He's hoping that it makes no difference. He's hoping that the third of the people he actually goes anywhere near don't actually hear him. But the exact opposite happens. God completely breaks in. They turn into massive repentance. And so Jonah runs away. And he goes and sits on a hill under a plant and watches. And he watches from a distance because he doesn't want to be proximate to a people that he absolutely despises. And so the challenging question that we have to ask in the context of this is, like, are there people who miss out on an opportunity to encounter God because of our opinions or attitudes towards them? And it might be that there's there's no one who I absolutely hate. There's no one who I hate as much as, Jonah hated the Ninevites. But are there people or people groups, or is there that person at work who, if we're really honest, if I invited them to a carol service or to Alpha and they came and then they became a Christian and then they came to church, I'd probably not want to come to church anymore. Do we have that person at work? Do we have people who there's just like minor or moderate conflict with? That prejudices our ability to invite them to stuff or to be real about our faith around them. And this is totally in no way meant to be this like guilt-driven thing of like, aren't we terrible? But it's just like there are some things that we need healing and freedom to be the people that God has called us to be. Is there anyone in our life who could miss out on an encounter with God because of our attitude towards them? Because there was an entire city that Jonah had that attitude towards, and God's really clear about his opinions on that. God doesn't want us watching from a distance to see what happens to a city. He wants us to get involved with what he is already doing in the city. So 1, condemnation. 2, control. I wonder if anything has ever in your life, I suspect the answer is yes, ever turned out not quite the same as you had planned. I have a long list of things in my life that haven't turned out the exact same as I had planned. Most notably, or least notably, was when we moved into our first house in London when we were first there, and we lived in this house in South London, and it was very nice. In the garden, it had this area that had already been built, that was like a mini allotment. It was sort of maybe the size of one of these slabs of stage, and it had like raised, like railway sleeper sides, and it had what looked like very fertile soil in the middle. And so Joe and I, neither of us are particularly gardeningly inclined, me even less particularly, and we thought during lockdown, we're going to buy some seeds, and we're going to make an allotment, and it's going to be like The Good Life, which is a TV program from the olden days, and we're going to grow everything, and every time we need a herb, we will go to the garden, and we will we'll have fresh herbs, and sometimes there will be fresh produce that we could cook for our children, and our children will be healthy, and life will be great. Everything will be beautiful. There'll be no more like oven pizza and all of this. It would just be quality homegrown vegetables every day. So we went, or maybe it was COVID, so we bought over the internet loads of seeds, and we had a day of doing the forking and the fertilizing and the finger and the thing, and we were just like, yes, we are going to live the dream. We're going to have fresh herbs with everything. I don't know what you need fresh herbs for, but you can get them dry. And it turns out that foxwee is the most toxic chemical that's ever been devised by anyone ever. Foxes must not have weed in the Garden of Eden because it would have just killed everything. Like the theology of that, I can't quite work out. But anyway, after a whole 6 months of laboring and watering and fertilizing and doing, we had one thing grow. One thing grow. And would you like to see a picture of the one thing that grew? Hopefully it's going to pop up. So this is Lady Roper with the fruit of her estate. And Joe's got quite a small head, so this is a new pound coin. That the carrot is barely bigger than. It's got quite an opulent, sort of head of hair, completely inedible. But it just didn't turn out quite how we had planned. It just didn't turn out quite how we had planned. And this is exactly the same thing that's going on in Jonah's mind. Again, a few times. He tells God, this is why I didn't want to go in the first place. One, because you know that I hate them because you know me. But then he explains, he actually says, and this is so crazy, he says, I knew you were gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and full of love, who relents from sending calamity. I knew you might let them get away with it. I knew you might stop hating them. I knew you might, set them free. I knew you might not bring the judgment on them that you promised you would. And just in case we're unsure about what God did promise, go back a couple of years. This is another prophet called Nahum, who says what God says about Nineveh, and this is what God said to the Israelites about Nineveh. I am against you, in Nahum chapter 3, he says, declares the Lord. I will lift your skirts over your face. I will show the nations your nakedness and the kingdoms your shame. I will pelt you with filth. I will treat you with contempt and make you a spectacle. All those who see you will flee from you and say, Nineveh is in ruins. Who will mourn for her? Where can I find anyone to comfort you? And in chapter 1, the Lord has given a command concerning you, Nineveh. You will have no descendants to bear your name. I will destroy the images and idols that are in the temple of your gods. I will prepare a grave for you. You are vile. And so you can get why Jonah has developed a certain narrative in his head. And God tells him to go. And he goes in the exact thing that he's worried about happening, because what Jonah ultimately wants to do is to tell God how to be God. He wants to have complete control over the type of God that God is and the sort of stuff that God does. And the response that God has to him is the same again. Is it right for you to be angry? So again, Jonah goes and hides under a plan and watches from a distance to see if God is going to do what Jonah thinks that God should do, instead of getting involved with what God is already doing in a city that Jonah has been called to. There's this amazing story after the resurrection in the Gospel of Luke, where some of the first disciples to encounter Jesus, or some of the first mates of disciples to encounter Jesus, do so on their journey home. To this place called Emmaus, and they're walking along, there's two of them, and just this random guy comes next to them, and they chat, and they talk, basically they're a bit sad, because their mate has just been killed, and they had loads of excitement and, sort of positivity about what was happening up until that moment, and sort of Jesus, very ingenuitively, was just like, tell me more about this guy. And there's this beautiful verse that gives me infinite hope and confidence, because these guys knew Jesus. They walked with him, and yet they're walking with him now. And in Luke chapter 24, verse 21, it says this: we had hoped. We had hoped that he was going to do X and Y and Z, that he was going to restore Israel, that he was going to do this. We had hoped, but he hasn't. And I wonder what the had hopes are in your life. I wonder what the things are that you thought God was going to do, or God was going to stop. The things that God was going to heal that he as yet hasn't. The relationships that maybe he was going to provide. Like what are the had hopes that you have? And the reality is that Jonah is sat under this plan, watching instead of getting involved because he's got so caught up in the version of God that he has built for himself, that he doesn't want to do anything that God is already doing until God behaves exactly like he wants him to. Like, what are the had hopes in your life? What are the things you expected God to provide that maybe he hasn't? And in the wrestling and in the struggle and in the tension and in the trauma of wrestling with those had hopes, have we maybe slightly stepped back and we're more happy to watch than we are to engage? So number 2, control. Condemnation, control. And finally, 3. And this is just, this is the one that I really struggle with. So none of this is me preaching at you. This is me reflecting of something that I'm finding hard as well. Comfort. So condemnation, control. And number 3, the third attitude is comfort. I wonder, what is the place where you go to find comfort and stillness and wholeness and warmth and escape from the world? I asked my wife yesterday for a funny story, and again, she threw me under the bus. I said, what would I say about, the place I go to for comfort? She just looked at me and she went, toilet. Which I think was like feedback and a good story idea at the same time. It's live feedback that she's given many times. But and then I reflected on this, so as many of you know, I used to be a doctor, and I can actually tell you to the nearest, I could what 3 words it, the exact location of the best toilet in every hospital that I've ever worked in. I promise you, and the best one out of all of them, ground floor, main corridor, Sandwell Hospital in Birmingham. It looks like a normal corridor, but there's this door with a fob to it. And when you walk inside, it's like an executive's bathroom. It's amazing. It's warm. I think it's next to the plant room, so it's it's heated. No one ever goes in there. It's carpeted. It's this is marvelous. Like on a night shift, you'd be just I'm going to go and have 15 minutes just to myself in this toilet. But that's, in the middle of a stressful, season, I would, long day in A&E, just 10 minutes, sort through my emails, go to the toilet. I know there's a lot of toilet chat, I apologize. But that would be the place where I go to for comfort. And this is kind of, Jonah's on his toilet. Jonah has retreated. He's made something to bring him comfort, to protect him from the world. And the even more confusing thing is God has provided something to help him be comfortable. And actually in that comfort, he gets so comfortable that it's again easy to sit and watch than it is to go and get involved with what God's doing. One of the quotes that I try and fail to live my life by is from the great theologian Bono. And who was in a band, for those of you who are young. He received this sort of Lifetime Achievement Chairman's Award from this amazing organization that was born out of the civil rights movement in America called the NAACP. And he did the most, just Google it later, go on YouTube and just Google Bono NAACP speech. That's your homework for today, it's amazing. But he, as this sort of mic drop towards the end of this speech, he said, true religion will not let us fall asleep in the comfort of our freedom. True religion will not let us fall asleep in the comfort of our freedom. We're blessed with so much stuff, but the tendency is it can make us so comfortable that we forget that God is active and work and doing stuff in the city, in our city, in that city. God is doing stuff. And I find for myself so often I just retreat to just being comfortable and to just finding things easy. And there's nothing wrong with comfort in itself, but there's something wrong when we use it to just permanently retreat like Jonah did, to move and just to watch. I'm just going to be one of those people that watches instead of one of those people that gets involved and does. And I think the best sort of example of the 2 different ways that we can go at this is if there's 2 people sitting in the dust in this story. One of them is the king of an empire, and the other one is an angry prophet. And actually, one of them is on his knees in repentance in the dust. And the other one is angry and full of resentment. One of them, is in the dust, taking action, drawing close to a God that he's experienced for the first time. The other one is sat in anger. One of them is responding to God. One of them is just watching on from afar. Like, which one's the prophet? Jonah watching from a distance because it's comfortable. And so the challenge that I feel this passage has given to me, and maybe it's the same for some of you, is like, what does it look for us to be just a little bit more uncomfortable? What does it look for us just to be a little bit more uncomfortable? And it doesn't have to be as intense as I'm making it sound, and I'm sorry if it sounds brutally intense. But like, what does it look like for us to be a little bit more uncomfortable? What does it look like for us to hold our faith a little bit further down our sleeve at work? What does it look like for us to be a little bit more bolder when we pray for people? Not because of any skill that we have, but because of all the resurrection power that fills us. What does it look like for us to be a little bit bolder when we create stuff? One of the beautiful things that's happening at church at the moment is people are writing songs. It was like a 2 to 3 year plan for Joe, and it's happened in like 2 to 3 months. But that involves being uncomfortable. It involves playing things like they did this morning that people don't know to see if anyone likes it, which I imagine is awful. Yes. What does it look like to be a bit more uncomfortable with our finances? What does it look like to be a bit more uncomfortable with the gifts and the talents and the skills and the abilities that God has given to me? What does it look like to be a bit more uncomfortable with who I invite into my life, who I invite into my house, who I invite into my circle of friends? What does it look like for us to be a bit more uncomfortable? So I think there's 3 attitudes that this passage just really cautions on being if we really, truly want to partner with what God is doing in a city. He's saying, beware of condemnation. Beware of feeling or wanting or believing that you have control over who God is and what God does. And beware of comfort. Because all these things will take you to a place where you just watch from a hilltop and maybe hope that God does great stuff, instead of getting in, getting dirty, getting on the dust with the King and telling him about who the God that he's been convicted by actually is. I just wonder which one of those it is for you this morning. Maybe there's resentment or anger or fractured relationship in your workplace or your home that's actually stopping you interacting with people in a way that would tell them about who Jesus is. I wonder if you are so rightfully struggling with the narrative of who you thought God was going to be and what he was going to do in and with and through your life, that it's really difficult to move on. And it's even harder to think about, how could I actually do anything to impact this city? And maybe like me, you're just a bit too comfortable at times. You need to just maybe level up, something to do with how you use your gifts and abilities or your finances or your creativity, or how you talk about your faith at work. And we're going to pray. I just think God wants to do something this morning. I think he wants to just tool us up for this city. One of the beautiful things of this room that we never planned to use as a church, it was going to be kids, is that you can see the city around us. And so I'd love us just to have that mindset. We've had sort of 2 weeks being like, what does God being everywhere mean for me? The cross, the Easter Saturday, the boat, the whale, the sin, the darkness, the despair. That's all about what does it mean for me, whereas the plant is about what does it mean for the city? What does it mean for the resurrection power to impact this city that we love? Shall we stand and we're gonna pray together?